Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Now, I've been asked to make a video by a faithful viewer, and she's saying I ought to make one about how to improve your English, particularly pronunciation, for Indians. First of all, a disclaimer. I recognise there are plenty of Indians who speak absolutely flawless English and have no need to improve their pronunciation. And many other native speakers of English from other lands speak it poorly. And I include my part of the world in that. So there's nothing wrong with Indian English per se. In a sense, there isn't really a correct English. Usually people would like to sound like they come from one of the major Anglophone countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia in particular. So I acknowledge there are Indians who speak absolutely perfect English. There are Indians who won the Nobel Prize for Literature writing entirely through English. I'm not suggesting English is better as a language, but by historical accident, that is the lingua franca. So it's a tremendous boon to be conversant in what's increasingly internationalese. That would probably be a better word for it, because it's not particularly connected to England anymore. So there are plenty of Indians who speak English that is crystal clear and exceedingly elegant. Would rank among those Dr. Shashi Tharoor. You might know from my other videos I don't see eye to eye with this gentleman, but I certainly can't quibble with the quality of his English. Or Nehru, looking far back, and he spoke outstanding English. Admittedly, he polished it by attending Harrow School, one of the most illustrious schools in the United Kingdom, and then Trinity College, Cambridge. So let's remind ourselves, why does language exist at all? Well, the purpose of language is communication. So long as what you're saying is comprehensible and or writing, then you have achieved your objective. I know I have some grammatical rules. Sometimes they're a trifle pedantry, and even if someone has made themselves understood, people will say, that was ungrammatical, even though others had no trouble getting their meaning. Or Indian sometimes said to me, I couldn't follow you, meaning I couldn't understand you, which of course is proper English, but it's a distinctively Indian English expression these days. So plenty of Indians have mastered the finer points of the language, getting things right, the distinction between less and fewer, for instance, that's to say uncountable and countable nouns. Whereas there are many indigenous speakers of the language in other zones of the world who say things like you was and you is. I'm talking about the British Isles, for instance. Shockingly, This sort of thing, or got less and fewer wrong. So people who come from the main Anglophone countries, they're not always right. Don't assume just because an American or a British person says it that he or she is right and an Indian person is wrong if they disagree over this. So what is an Anglophone country? Well, I shan't get into that debate. Now, arguably India is an Anglophone country since English is one of the 14 languages that are official at a national level and indeed often official at state level as well. So about 25% of Indians speak English with some degree of fluency, and obviously they're more passive users. So it's rising all the time as illiteracy has been virtually abolished. Obviously, there are plenty of people who are illiterate in other languages, but just not English. Now, I was surprised the figure was so low as 25%, but of course, the sort of people I mingled with in my 3 extended trips to Hindustan were people who are mainly drawn from the learned professions or business, people living in the major conurbations, and that sample is decidedly unrepresentative. In rural India, the figure would be considerably lower. And of course, the elderly people, those from the scheduled castes, certain tribes who haven't come into contact with tertiary education very much, or don't meet foreigners a great deal, and who speak English rather less often. Right. Notably, English does not come from England originally. As the 5th century AD, the language started to emerge. We don't have any written records in English from the time. When the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded England, coming from what we now call the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, that's why there's still states in Germany called Saxony, Lower Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and so forth. The Jutes from Jutland, that's the mainland portion of Denmark. Previously, people in what's now England been speaking Latin and various Celtic languages prior to that. So even the word England didn't refer to the whole of England, was only what we now call East Anglia, West Anglia. And it was only in 1735 AD that the words England and English were invented by a monk called the Venerable Bede, who wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which he penned in Latin. So English was scarcely a written language until the 9th century AD, and the English were doing most of their writing in Latin until probably about the 18th century, where you began to write more and more in English. So there are various different correct codes of English, and Indian English is as well, particularly the more upper class version of it. I hope that's not class prejudice of me, that would be more widely understood abroad. Now, sometimes overseas where people are unable to comprehend Indian English, really that's the fault of the hearer rather than the speaker. So I speak in received pronunciation, which is a code of English, as in a version of it from the United Kingdom. It's found throughout the United Kingdom. I'm actually from the Republic of Ireland. But the RP accent is most common in southeastern England, so that's the London area. The United Kingdom is not very large, only about 900 kilometres at its longest point, but there is a great variety of accents. So India may well have a smorgasbord of accents within the English tongue, but I can't distinguish between them sufficiently. I was once able to tell somebody is from Calcutta by her English. I remember in Pakistan one time, somebody inquired of me, is there a sort of Oxford English? And I said, no, well, there isn't really. I mean, a lot of Oxford people, Oxonians, people at the university, would speak RP, but plenty of speak with their regional accent. A person from Manchester, she might speak in a Mancunian accent and so forth, or people from abroad who are studying at Oxford University. And this chap who asked me that incidentally was unaware that I was an Oxford undergraduate at the time. So that's my rather lengthy introduction. So there's Hinglish, which is a melange of Hindi and English, where I had some colleagues who had Malayalam as a mother tongue, and they said that they peppered their English liberally with words from their native language, and indeed grammatical structures therefrom as well. So because Indians are often speaking English to each other and not to Firang, they might be unaware that words such as Firang are not English words. So even British English and American English have got some accretions from various Indian tongues, most notably Hindi. So Firang is not an English word. So outside of South Asia, most people would be unaware of what it means. Or there are other words, numerical ones, such as kror, lakh, and so on, lak, which foreigners usually don't know, unless, like me, they have some experience of South Asia. Incidentally, most of what I'm saying would be applicable to those who hail from India's immediate neighbours, not China, the other South Asian nations. Gunda, for example. Now, I happen to know what it means, but people in most of the remainder of the Anglosphere would be blissfully ignorant of this word. You don't want to meet a Gunda, put it like that. Thug, for example, has very much entered the English language, and Americans often say it too, though I would suspect most of them do not know of its etymology. One of the mistakes that Indians often make when pronouncing English is failing to distinguish between V and W. Well, you watch my lips very closely as I pronounce the names of these sounds and therefore produce the sounds V and W. So the W, the V and the W. So try distinguishing between them in wet, vet, wet, vet. So we mustn't get them wrong. We must be very careful about that, and certainly not very careful. You notice that the position of the lips and the tongue in relation to the teeth is decidedly different in V and W. So it surprises me that people don't draw that distinction. Now, we generally don't roll the R, or should I say roll the R. If we do so, it's only because we want to be very funny. It's for comedic effect. The TH sound. Now, many Britishers can't get this right. Londoners, speaking Cockney, that's a working class London accent, can't pronounce the TH, putting your tongue in front of your teeth, perhaps only a millimetre in front of your teeth, and say, rather than this, that, there, those, they're saying vis, vat, ver, vos, and mother, brother, and father, saying mother, brother, father, and thank you instead of thank you. Likewise, in the Republic of Ireland, most people can't produce the TH sound, th, but that's that. So make sure you get your TH sound right. It's not a D, D, or a T like T. And obviously knowing how to pronounce the vowels correctly. Let's say Latin, because one of my Pakistani girlfriend of mine years ago, she used to say Latine, but of course it's Latin. Yeah, not to press your tongue up against your palate like that. Not to press your tongue up against your palate like that. That's me attempting to speak in my ordinary accent whilst doing that, and it sounds discernibly different. And I realise in most Indian languages that is the correct way to speak. In English, I wouldn't say it's exactly wrong, but obviously you wouldn't speak in a more internationalized version of the language. Then there's some of the then there's some non-linguistic communication, such as wobbling your head. Again, that's not wrong, and that's a way of saying yes to people. But if you're from India, it would be perfectly blatant to you that wobbling your head indicates the affirmative. But people from other regions of the world don't know that. I remember I was mystified, first of all. I got this in Nepal, actually, not India initially, asking someone a question and they're responding like this. And to my way of thinking, it suggested uncertainty, weighing up the options. There's this possibility and there's that possibility, and I'm still considering the two possibilities. I'm not saying yes or no. So asking the person the question several times and becoming deeply frustrated because he just wasn't answering the question. But of course, in his mind, he'd already answered me a dozen times. So that's the fascinating thing, the way the some of the hand gestures or head movements are actually part of the language, like this one and that one are part of the language as well. So the PB distinction, and of course I know there are plenty of Indians who have no difficulty about this and get it absolutely right. And as I said, people in Ireland and Great Britain often mispronounce things too or mangle the grammar. But these are both plosives, like P is P and B is B, obviously, because talking about Pakistan, it becomes very obvious when Pakistan is pronounced Pakistan. Now, I realise in Urdu, this distinction isn't drawn, so that would actually be the correct pronunciation. So if you were saying the name of the language as people of that country would pronounce it, it's difficult to say you're exactly wrong, but some people wouldn't know that abroad. And if you said Pakistan, they wouldn't realise you're talking about that country, which is a capital named Islamabad. So to make sure you're getting P and B correct, remember that when breath comes out for one of them but not the other one, P and B, P and B. With the P, you'll feel air coming out. With the B, you will not. You could even hold a piece of paper over your mouth and see when it moves because you're exhaling with one of them, not the other. The same as with the H sound. Not that Indians ever have trouble pronouncing that, but I had Russophone pupils who were flummoxed by that one. So let's not forget the ship or sheep. Ship as in a large boat, with a short sound, dotted, and sheep with a long vowel, ship and sheep. There's even a book about this entitled Ship and Sheep. So if you ask for a sheet, make sure it's a long sound and not a short one, or you might get something that you really don't want on your bed. And obviously not economizing on the prepositions. Saying 5 o'clock morning, that's wrong. It should be 5 o'clock in the morning. And there are people in the United Kingdom, particularly in a county called Yorkshire, who often omit their articles, a and the, things like that, which is bad. So there's some expressions which are just wrong. I remember people saying, open the steering, as in steer more widely if you're steering the car. But open the steering is wrong. Of course, I understood what the bloke was trying to tell me, so perhaps I shouldn't whinge. Maybe I'm being too pernickety, because, as I said myself, the aim of language is to communicate, and I had understood the signification of his words, even though I thought they were framed sloppily. So there are various anachronisms which have survived in Indian English, which were once current in British English, and again, these aren't wrong, but you might choose to keep them in because you find it colourful, and I certainly appreciated the variegated nature of the English language, and I deliberately use a few archaic expressions in my own discourse. So these might strike people as faintly quaint and or Victorian. I can't remember, some early 20th century novel had this one, get in a soup, as in you're in a difficult situation, you're on a sticky wicket. But people abroad would almost never say, if you get in a soup, give me a call. I'm talking about taking food rather than eating it, because you're not just simply physically removing it, you are eating it. So we tend to say just eating and not taking food. Talking about my mother as mother and my father as father, we generally use the possessive pronoun, my father, my mother, things like that. I remember a young man saying to me, father is ill. And again, I can't say he was incorrect to do that. Not sure it was clumsy either, but there we are. Take it or leave it. So people are sometimes super polite, which of course is to be commended. I remember a boy asked me to help him write a letter, and I was saying, well, you don't know the person's name, you're going to begin, dear sir. And he said, no, it's got to be respected, sir. I thought, well, that comes across as obsequious, but certainly better to err on the side of courtesy rather than discourtesy. Or requesting people saying, kindly do this, kindly do that, is something I've chosen to do myself. Again, it may strike people as old-fashioned. You may wish to be old-fashioned. That doesn't have to be bad. So it varies. I mean, like in most countries, there's a huge amount of variety amongst people, and some people are unfailingly polite, others very much the opposite. Most people are in between, reasonably polite. So some people come across as gruff if they skip out the politeness words. Mind your P's and Q's. P's and Q's meaning please and thank you. It's almost impossible to overdo them. But I realise in India sometimes the courtesy is contained in the appellation, what you call people, Ji or Bapu or whatever it is, depending on the situation. Whereas in the rest of the Anglosphere, these appellations are not as important. They matter somewhat, but really please and thank you and so on are crucial. I remember a young lady asking me, may I have your good name? Which I thought was a very delicate way to frame the question. So I might say, what's your name, please? I'm not saying that she was mistaken in the way that she formed the sentence. And we don't talk about someone having a good name, but it's very polite. And I'm sure you could teach people in other parts of the world a thing or two about how to express yourself in a courteous fashion. Or a Fijian Indian saying, so-and-so, he's not a jungly. And I could figure it out. He's not saying the person is not an uncouth rustic. Or talking about freedom. Now, I know you're talking about 1947, but those who are not so well acquainted with Indian history wouldn't realise what you're alluding to. Gora Log, I know who we are, but people outside of Hindustan might not know. So there's some sort of misconceptions in India, I noticed, thinking that all whites speak English. Now, apart from, obviously the Anglophone countries, in Sweden and the Netherlands, about 90% of people speak English to some degree. Young people often excellent. In Germany, it's getting up that way. But I've been to other white majority countries, that's very much not the case. Even in France and Italy or Spain, away from the main tourist centres or cities, a lot of people do not speak English at all. Or, Romania, in the countryside, very few people would. Or in Russia, there are plenty of people, even people in the learned profession, some that speak no English at all. Obviously, those who speak it very well. So don't imagine that either. Anyway, so these are just a few of my thoughts about how Indians can speak a more international version of English. The accent's not wrong. Unfortunately, some people have their accent mocked. And accent, I suppose, it's like dress, really, because people will judge you. I know it's unfair, but they will. So you wear better clothes to produce a better impression, even if it's not really you. You might feel faintly traitorous to modify your accent, saying, this is my identity. I'm not going to change my accent for the sake of other people. That's their problem, not mine. And I'm proud of where I come from. So I'm not changing it. Others have found it prudent to amend their accent because they think it just makes me more easily understood, or indeed it leads to greater professional advancement because people do judge my appearances. I know it's unfair, but that's life.